Good Shabbos. This morning I met with an electrician and he came into my house and he noticed my yarmulke and he said, "Are you a rabbi?" And I hesitantly said, "Yes." And thinking I'm not sure where this is going to go, he went on to say, "Oh, you're the chosen nation." And I answered like Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof. Maybe God should choose someone else. I said that as a joke to him, but it reflects what we have in this week's portion. In this week's portion, it starts off after a few paragraphs. It says, "This day God has commanded you to keep all of the commandments, and God has distinguished you today to be a chosen or a treasured nation, and we have chosen God to follow his ways." And there's a reciprocity in this portion, in this section, saying that we follow God's mitzvos, we follow the commandments of God, and he chooses us and he makes us his treasure. In other places, he used the word, we're a nivchar, we're chosen. And here it also says, Am kadosh l'Hashem Elokecha, we are holy to God. And there's this idea that we think of as being chosen. And the question is, what does it mean to be chosen? When you read on in this week's portion, it's one of the portions which has the most curses to those people who don't keep the commandments. It talks about all the terrible things that will happen when you don't keep the commandments. And that's why the joke is like, we don't want to be chosen. With these commandments come responsibilities, and the difficulty in following the commandments could lead to us to all kinds of tragedy, which has happened in Jewish history, as the electrician mentioned to me. He couldn't understand why. And I think what we have to understand is, what does it mean to be chosen? And at the risk of repeating myself, there's another section of the Torah which says that we are looked at by the people as Am Chacham v'Navan Hagoy Hagadol Hazeh. We are a nation which is wise and understanding, this great nation. Ki chachmaskam avinaskam le'nei amim, referring to the commandments that we have, because it's the wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. And there's a sense that our chosenness is the fact that we have these mitzvahs. We're not just chosen inherently. Perhaps we are, but I think you could read this. It's not just like we are inherently kadosh, we inherently holy. We know we have a history. We go back to schosavos, to the merit of our forefathers. We rely on the fact that our forefathers accepted the Torah on Mount Sinai. But at the end of the day, what makes us special is if we have these commandments and we follow them. And if we don't follow them, comes the responsibility. And the following of them is, as I quoted before, it only is true if it reflects that we're chacham v'nafan, that we're actually wise and understanding. That if we could see and project a certain wisdom in following the commandments of the Torah, as if we act in the proper way, then we become, as they always quote, the Or LaGoyim, the light unto the nations. It's just like when the electrician asked me if I'm Jewish or a rabbi, I always am afraid, because with that recognition that I'm Jewish comes a responsibility that people will judge the Jewish nation based on what I do. And therefore there's either a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name, or a Chil Hashem, a desecration of God's name, based on the small actions that I might perform in the streets of Halifax. And ultimately, what we have to deal with is what makes us look like we're chacham enough and like we're wise and understanding. And here I think it's very simple that we have to understand that don't just rely on our chosenness. Our chosenness is to follow those things which are sensible and moral and ethical. And we have to understand, and again, I apologize for repeating this, but we have to understand that the commandments in the Torah and the belief that we have in God is all tied to understanding that God works within nature. God works with the science that he created. And therefore, we also have to follow that science. We have to follow logic. We can't just say, as I read on some blog today, don't worry, people will die whenever they die. God has a chosen time for them. No, God chooses the time, the way I understand it, based on our actions. and how we take responsibility and how we follow the rules of the Torah and the rules of nature. And therefore, we have to act responsibly in everything that they do. I'll just give you a simple example and the difference in different streams of thinking within Judaism, how they both really come to the same conclusion. The Maimonides is known as the great sort of Jewish philosopher who followed, to a large degree, Aristotelian Greek philosophy. And he was also known as one of the greatest doctors of his time. And in a sense, what he's saying, by being a doctor and by choosing that as his profession, is saying that there's no contradiction between us taking into our own hands responsibility for our future and for our own health and following the laws of the Torah. Therefore, Maimonides not only was a great philosopher, he was also the first and greatest codifier of Jewish law. He held strictly to the law, but he also held strictly to the fact that we have to follow that which is sensible. On the other hand, if you want to compare him to Nachmanides, Ramban, who is a Kabbalist, a Jewish mystic, you could argue that he says the opposite, because at one point he makes a comment which says that the Torah says, all the sickness, kol hamachla shasamti b'Mitzrayim, all the sickness which I placed against the Egyptians, I will not, lo osam olecha, I will not place on you, ki ani Hashem rofecha, because I, God, am your healer. And he makes a comment, he says that really you shouldn't be going to a doctor, you should really be relying on your relationship with God. The problem with that is, it's a nuanced approach, and if you read different comments that Nachmanides makes throughout his commentary, you see that he didn't hold strictly to that. But the major problem is Nachmanides himself was a doctor. So he's telling you not to go to doctors, and he's saying you shouldn't go to not to go to doctors, and he is actually the doctor. And the answer is, as many commentaries on explaining Nachmanides says, is that he was talking about in an ideal world. In an idyllic world in the Garden of Eden, in this purely spiritual world, God is totally in charge based on our Yirah Shamayim and our fear of heaven, of our Dveikus to Hashem, our cleaving to God. Our relationship to God will determine whether we're healthy or we're sick, whether we live and whether we die. But that ideal is only exists in its purest form with maybe in the Garden of Eden before they ate from the tree of knowledge. But once we leave the Garden of Eden, we enter the real world that we live in, the day-to-day world that we live in. Nachmanides also recognizes that we have to go to a doctor. We have to rely on the rules of nature, understand the rules of nature, and therefore we're responsible for ourselves. So therefore, what does it mean to be chosen and to be treasured? It's that we have a set of rules, we have a set of laws, which are supposed to reflect the truths of the universe. And if we grasp that, and we live like that, and we live by those rules, then we will be considered Am Chacham V'Navan Hagai Hagadol, this great, wise, and understanding people. And then, in this portion, the blessings will occur, and not the curses. The curses are not following the laws, not following ethical behavior, not following common sense and logic, and following the rules of nature that God placed into this world. Right? When we read that God created the world, we read that God is the one who made all of nature. And therefore, the relationship of God to nature is very clear, but it's not that God overrides nature. It's God is the force behind nature. And we have to work within those rules. And hopefully, with that, we could go into this new year that's coming, and we're going to pray. We're going to pray for health and success, and that we're able to earn a living. All of those things go hand in hand with the type of behavior we have, both in following the rules of nature and following the rules of God. Good Shabbos.